students, and welcome back to Political Science 1513, American Federal Government. As always, I am your instructor, Connor Alford, and in this video we're going to begin the first in our two-part series on political intermediaries. We'll talk about what political intermediaries are and what role they play in the democratic process. We'll identify the three major types of political intermediary, and then we're going to focus on two of these, parties and interest groups. We'll talk about what they are and how they are distinct. We'll discuss the concept of selective incentives, we'll discuss party faces, and America's current party system. All right, let's begin by going over our learning objectives. The first learning objective asks for you to explain the concept of a political intermediary and the role that political intermediaries play in our democratic process. The second learning objective asks for you to identify the three main types of political intermediary currently active in American politics and describe the main differences between political parties and political interest groups. Next, you need to be able to describe the main strategies that interest groups use to influence government decision makers and how they overcome what we call the free rider issue. And then you need to be able to distinguish between the three faces of the modern American political party, Pig, Pie, and Po, and identify examples of the individuals that operate within each of these three faces of the modern political party. Finally, the last learning objective directs students to describe current realities in America's party system and to identify the major factors which help to explain the persistence of this system. We're going to begin with that first learning objective. So we're going to distinguish between political intermediaries by first identifying what they are, and then discussing the three major types of political intermediaries and what political intermediaries do. And then we're going to move on to begin discussing some of the differences between parties and interest groups. All right, we'll begin with the definition. A political intermediary is simply an institution or organization that helps to facilitate collective communication between the government on the one hand and the people on the other hand. In other words, these are the institutions or organizations that you use to learn about and influence government decision makers, and that government decision makers use to learn about and influence voters. The three main types of political intermediary currently active in American politics are political parties and interest groups, which we'll talk about here, and the mass media, which we'll discuss later. All three of these are tools that you as a citizen can use to influence or learn about the government, and that the government can use to influence or learn about you. For instance, you can learn a great deal about the types of policies that our current president might want to pursue for our country using his position of authority based on the political party he, or maybe one day she, chooses to affiliate with. You can also say the opposite. The president can learn about the voters of a particular city or state, for instance, by figuring out what portion of them are Democrats versus Republicans. And then when the president goes to speak to the voters of that state or that city, he, or again, maybe one day she, can tailor the message presented to what it would be most palatable to people of that particular political party. If our president signs into law a policy you don't like, you can learn about it by watching the mass media. And then if a bunch of people are protesting in the streets, that's probably because they're dissatisfied. Those protests will probably get covered by the media, and the president can learn that the people are unhappy by, again, watching the media. The president can then engage in PR and damage control and convince the people that maybe they're overreacting or they should reconsider by going on television, doing interviews, and talking to the people. So this is a way that government decision makers provide people with information to influence them in ways that make them more favorable, and this is the way that people provide information to government decision makers to get them to change their behavior, addressing our wants, needs, or expectations. Bottom line, political intermediaries play an important part in the democratic process by allowing government decision makers and governed individuals in the general public to communicate and adjust to one another's wants, needs, and expectations, even outside of the ordinary election cycle. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about two of the major types of political intermediaries, political parties, and interest groups. So we'll also look at some definitions for each of these terms. A political party is an organization or group of political activists who come together to win elections, operate government, and gain direct control over public policy. Whereas an interest group is any organized group of individuals making policy-related appeals to government. Both interest groups and political parties can help to facilitate collective action and communication during which people in the general public are trying to learn about or influence their government, or the government is trying to learn about and influence the people. While they are both a type of political intermediary, however, and while they do sometimes compete or cooperate in the same arenas, however, it is important to understand that there are some critical differences which distinguish parties from interest groups. The first and most important difference between political parties on the one hand and interest groups on the other hand is that political parties run candidates in elections, whereas interest groups do not, although interest groups may try to influence those candidates who are nominated and run by the parties. Every election cycle, the political parties in our country get together in what are called primary elections. During a primary election, the rank and file members of a party get to vote to decide who their party will run in various congressional or even in the presidential election cycle. So, for example, in 2020, the Republican political party nominated one of their own members, Donald Trump, to be their candidate for President of the United States. The Democrats also selected one of their own members, Joe Biden, to be their candidate for President of the United States. In the general election, these two candidates then competed against one another, and you know the history surrounding the rest of that election cycle. The bottom line, however, is that while we did have an official Republican candidate selected by the Republican Party and a Democrat candidate selected by the Democrat Party, we did not have an official NRA candidate, a National Rifle Association candidate, or a Planned Parenthood candidate, because neither the NRA nor Planned Parenthood are political parties. Neither of them are electoral organizations. Political parties, especially in the United States, are fundamentally electoral organizations. Their fundamental goal is to help their own members win elections, which they can't do unless they run those members in elections. Interest groups are different. They're not electoral organizations, so they don't run their own candidates. That does not mean that they are irrelevant to the electoral process, because while interest groups may not nominate and run their own official candidates, they can support or influence those candidates who have been nominated and run by the parties. So, for instance, the National Rifle Association in 2020 somewhat begrudgingly supported Donald Trump because they thought he would be more friendly towards their pro-Second Amendment agenda than would the alternative, Joe Biden. Planned Parenthood, which is a pro-abortion interest group and lobbying organization, similarly provided a great deal of financial and political support for Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden was not the Planned Parenthood candidate. He wasn't nominated by Planned Parenthood. He was the Democrat candidate nominated by the Democrats in their primary election. But Planned Parenthood attempted to influence him and to encourage him to very boldly promote policies that were consistent with their agenda. And they were able to get him to do so by, again, offering public, political, and financial support. On the other hand, the NRA did the exact same thing with Donald Trump. They were able to influence the Republican candidate by offering support in exchange for promises, public promises, to promote policies more consistent with Second Amendment freedoms. So interest groups don't run their candidates, whereas political parties do. That's the first and most important difference separating these two different types of political intermediary. And I say that this is the most important difference because all of the other differences we are about to talk about are a consequence of the first. So for instance, the second major difference between parties and interest groups is that parties have direct control over public policy, whereas interest groups only have indirect influence. Do understand that both interest groups and political parties are fundamentally private clubs or organizations. The Republicans are not a part of the government. The Democratic political party is not an official or formal part of the government. However, the lawmaking organs of our government are controlled by political parties. Because remember, political parties run candidates in elections. When those members of the political parties win their elections, they take seats in government. And those seats in government give them direct control over public policy. So for instance, currently, as of the recording of this lecture, Democrats have control of the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And we have a Democrat in the White House office. What that means is that for all effects and purpose, for the time being, Democrats have complete control over what laws pass and fail in our government. Republicans can try to slow their efforts down, they can obstruct them, but for the most part, our country and its public policies are under the direct control of Congress and the President, and those are both controlled by the Democratic Party. So Democrats have direct control over public policy. In prior years, as in 2016, it was the opposite. Republicans had both chambers of Congress and the White House, and so they had direct control over public policy. But in order to gain this direct formal control over public policies, it is necessary to run candidates. Since interest groups do not run candidates, they don't have any formal or direct control over public policy and must therefore rely on indirect influence. They might not have any official lawmaking authority because they don't control Congress like the Democrats or Republicans might, but they can still shape public policy by influencing those individuals who are in power. Remember, an interest group is just an organized group of individuals making policy-related appeals to government decision makers. And so that's what they're going to do. They might not hold seats in Congress because they never ran candidates, but they do have the ability to communicate with those people who are in Congress and convince those people to support policies that are consistent with their agenda. The NRA can convince members of Congress to pass pro-Second Amendment policies, and Planned Parenthood can convince members of Congress to pass pro-choice or pro-abortion policies. So those are the two major differences. Parties run candidates, interest groups don't. Parties therefore have direct control over public policy, and interest groups only have indirect influence. But there are also two minor differences that we're briefly going to touch upon. Because political parties need to win elections, they run candidates, they tend to have very generalized agendas. Whereas the fact that interest groups do not run candidates and are therefore not trying to win elections means that they can afford to have a much more specialized agenda. You're therefore more likely to see organizations like the NRA or Planned Parenthood which focus on very, very limited or narrow issue areas like abortion and family planning or guns on the interest group side of the screen than on the political party side. See, voters who participate in elections and determine which candidates win tend to have very varied interests. Some of us do care about things like abortion and the Second Amendment, but we also care about things like the economy, and we care about things like the environment, and we care about things like national security or immigration, and we care about things like crime. And if the candidates being run by a political party aren't willing to talk about all of these different issues we care about, we're not likely to support them, and therefore they're not likely to win the election. And as a result, political parties have to have very generalized agendas if they want to be successful. They publish these generalized agendas in the form of what we call party platforms. There is a Republican Party platform, and there's a Democrat Party platform. And the party platforms basically list all of the major issues that voters care about, from abortion to war and zoos, and say, here is the official position of our party on that particular issue. That's not always true of interest groups. Sometimes it is. There are some ideological interest groups that choose to take positions on a whole host of different issues, but they don't necessarily have to in order to be successful. They can specialize, whereas specialized political parties almost always fail. For instance, the Green Party only really wants to talk about the environment, and while many people do care about the environment, they also care about the economy, they care about national security, so on and so forth, and since the Green Party doesn't really talk about those issues that many voters care about, they consistently lose elections. But you do have a lot of environmental interest groups that are very, very successful, because they don't need to win elections in order to survive. Finally, because interest groups don't run candidates, but political parties do, the major political parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, have legal advantages in elections that no one else enjoys. So if the NRA or Planned Parenthood did one day decide to run candidates, they wouldn't get those legal advantages. For instance, in Oklahoma, if you win either the Republican or Democrat nomination as a candidate, your name automatically appears as an option that voters can choose on Election Day by checking the corresponding box on their ballot. Whereas if Planned Parenthood or the NRA decided to run a candidate, even after they had nominated their candidate, that candidate would then have to go out and get a whole bunch of signatures from registered voters in the state just to petition the government to add the candidate's name to the ballot so that the candidate can be an option on Election Day. Now that we know the major differences between interest groups and parties, we know what political intermediaries are and what they do, let's narrow the scope and focus particularly on interest groups. We'll talk about what interest groups do, what their primary functions are, why these are controversial, why they might be beneficial, and then we're going to talk about the free rider issue and how interest groups are able to overcome it by offering their members selective benefits. So remember that an interest group is just an organized group of individuals making policy-related appeals to government. And what we're going to discover is that these interest groups have two primary functions that they fulfill within the modern democratic process of our country. First, interest groups serve to promote what we call special interests. A special interest can be best understood by contrasting it with a general interest. A general interest is a want, need, or expectation that basically the entire population cares about to an equal extent. Whereas a special interest is something that a specific component or demographic within the population cares about to an elevated degree, but that the general population is not necessarily all that concerned with. So, for instance, we have a general interest in not being the victims of a nuclear holocaust, because the bomb don't discriminate. You'll be equally dead after a nuclear bomb has been dropped on your city, whether you are white or black, male or female, adult, child, elderly, young, gay, straight, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Everyone has more or less an equal interest in nuclear security. But there are certain issues that disproportionately interest or impact certain portions of the population. So, for example, the survivability of certain indigenous languages that are slowly vanishing as they lose their native speakers. That's an issue that is probably of greater interest and importance to you if you are a member of one of the tribes of people whose language is dying out. If you are a Native American, you probably have a special interest in tribal sovereignty. That issue probably matters more to you and has a greater impact on you than on the general population. Some people have also argued that women have certain special interests when it comes to things like intrauterine devices and hormonal birth control. Why? Well, first off, women can get pregnant and men can't. So you could therefore argue that women are more immediately impacted by things like access to contraception. That's not to say that men have no interest in access to contraception, because of course any guy will tell you that, yeah, he cares about whether and when or if he becomes a father. So I'm not saying that men don't have any interest. I'm just saying that you could argue that because women get pregnant and men don't, women have a special interest, a particularly important interest. And this is magnified by the fact that women are the ones who can use intrauterine devices and hormonal birth control. Dudes, if you're trying to implant an intrauterine device into yourself, stop it. It's not going to work, and you're going to wind up in the hospital. If you're taking birth control pills, stop it. That doesn't work. The fact that women are the ones who actually use intrauterine devices and hormonal birth control means that women are probably going to have a greater interest in the expenditures and the affordability and the accessibility associated with accessing these types of contraceptive service. Now, I chose to start by focusing on Native Americans rather than women for a reason. See, many people are going to argue that when it comes to women, it's not really all that necessary to have a whole bunch of interest groups to make sure that their wants, needs, and expectations are being addressed by the government. Why not? Well, because there are simply a lot of them. Women are slightly over half of the American population and well over half of the American voting population. And what that means is that if a congressperson or other government elected official is ignoring the wants, needs, and expectations of women, women are able to address that simply by voting. If 54% of your voters in a particular congressional district are women, and you don't ever pay attention to what women want, need, or expect, you're going to lose your next election. But that's not true of certain disenfranchised or very small demographics within the general population. So again, Native Americans are a really good example of why interest groups might be a necessary or positive part of the democratic process. Because again, we do know that Native American populations and individuals have certain issues and problems that they rely on the government to help them address and solve. Things like tribal sovereignty, things like the survivability of indigenous languages, and yeah, things like violence against Native American women, diabetes, alcoholism, reservation policies. These are all things that are of special interest to Native Americans. The problem without interest groups is that while Native Americans are definitely a unique demographic with their own special interests, their own unique legitimate problems that warrant government time and attention and deserve to be addressed and talked about. They're not a very large percent of the overall population. So if we have, say, a presidential election, for example, it would be very possible for a candidate to win an election without ever talking about or taking a position on any Native American issues, because there simply are not enough Native Americans to affect the outcome of an election unless it's already very, very tight. So 9 times out of 10, simply participating in the democratic process is not an effective way for Native Americans to influence government decision makers and make sure that those decision makers are aware of and paying attention to their special interests. Fortunately, we've got organizations, special interest groups, like the NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians, which, and this is their second major function, facilitate collective action in order to shape public policy. Right? The 2 major functions of interest groups are promoting special interests and facilitating collective action. The NCAI recognizes that because the electorate is very large and the percentage of the electorate that's made up of Native Americans is very small, if the government is going to be made aware of and compelled to pay attention to Native issues, they're going to have to do more than simply vote in isolation. So they organize individuals from different tribal communities across the country, identify the problems facing these communities, and then organize members of those communities to address them or to reach out to and exert influence on government so that government will address them. Now again, this is arguably a very good thing, because most of us are probably totally willing to say, yeah, the survival of indigenous languages is an important issue for Native American people, and it deserves our time and attention. They have legitimate problems, and they are citizens of this country. Therefore, it is appropriate that the government will help them address those problems. That's what it's there for, right? Well, maybe. Here's why this is controversial. See, we're a democratic republic. And what that means is that, at least in theory, we have a government by and for the people. Not a government by and for certain segments of the people, but for the people as a whole. And therefore, when you have a special interest that conflicts with the general interest, what's in the best interest of a subgroup or a minority within our population should be placed second to what's in the interest of the public at large. In other words, many people argue that democracy means that the government doesn't pay attention to the wants, needs, and expectations of specific demographics or special interest groups, but of the public at large. And because the public at large doesn't tend to organize as well as these minority demographics with their own special interest groups, what we're going to discover is that in reality, government decision makers today seem to be more responsive to special interests than the general interest. Not only that, but what we're going to find is that they are especially responsive to the special interests of different groups that have very strong public image and lots of monetary resources. And so it is argued quite frequently, and not altogether incorrectly, that the presence of interest groups in the democratic process and the role they play in promoting special interests actually subverts the general interest and corrupts our democratic process. I'll let you decide which spin you want to put on it. You can argue that they're good because they're making sure that wants, needs, and interests of disenfranchised groups aren't being ignored, or you can argue that they're bad because they corrupt the democratic process. I don't care which position you take, just understand that this is a controversy. Whether you like interest groups or not, the next thing that we can talk about is how they go about fulfilling these functions. How do they promote special interests and facilitate collective action? Well, generally speaking, I want you to understand that interest groups have 3 major strategies that they can use to fulfill their primary functions. The first and most successful, as well as the most controversial strategy used by interest groups to achieve their goals, is what we call lobbying. Lobbying is any attempt to influence public policy by persuading or informing government decision makers. There are a few points that I want to make about this. First, note that I said government decision makers and not elected officials. Some government decision makers, like members of Congress or the President, are elected officials, and you can lobby them. But you can also lobby unelected decision makers, like judges and justices, or bureaucrats over in the executive branch. or presidential appointees who serve on the cabinet. These are all individuals who help to shape public policy, and therefore when you communicate with them and you advise them on how they should use their decision-making authority, you are lobbying. I also want to note that there is a difference between professional lobbying and the general citizen lobbying that all of us engage in anytime we call a congressperson, write a letter to a government decision maker, or vote. In the same way that there's a difference between singing in your shower and being a professional singer. Finally, I want to note that not only is it accurate to say that not all citizens are professional lobbyists, it is also accurate to say that professional lobbying can be, and perhaps should be, regarded as a controversial profession. And the reason that lobbying is so controversial is that the information presented by lobbyists when they go to try and persuade government decision makers is not always good and accurate, and the arguments that they're presenting aren't always consistent with the general interest. Their job is to promote a special interest, not the general interest. They're not looking out for the public at large. They're looking out for their particular parts of the public, and they are trying to cherry pick which facts and information and arguments are most likely to convince government decision makers to use their authority in a way that promotes that special interest. Now again, you can call this persuading and informing government decision makers, but you could also put a negative spin on this. You could redefine lobbying just as accurately by saying that lobbying is an attempt to influence public policy by manipulating and misinforming or deceiving government decision makers. That's not necessarily incorrect. One thing I will note, however, is that it's not necessarily correct either. This is kind of subjective. It's a matter of personal opinion. Some people argue that lobbying is important because you have different lobbying groups on basically any side of any major issue. And so by listening to the lobbyists from either side, government decision makers are able to get a full picture of the issues at stake. And therefore, even though individual lobbyists might not be counted on to present reliable information, they still play an important role in keeping our government decision makers aware of the unique problems facing our different communities. If I am an elected official in Oklahoma, for example, it might be helpful for me to pay attention to what the NCAI, the National Congress of American Indians, has to tell me, just so I know how Native Americans feel about different issues in our communities, and so that I know what unique problems are facing the tribes of our state. If I don't know what problems are facing them because I haven't listened to their interest groups, I can't address those problems, even if I want to. So again, lobbying is the most common and it is the most effective strategy used by interest groups, but it's also the most controversial. If lobbying fails, in other words, if an interest group is unable to convince a current decision maker to exercise his or her authority in a way that is consistent with that interest group's agenda, an alternative strategy is electioneering. If you can't get the person currently in power to work with you, replace them with somebody that will. Electioneering is when an interest group supports a candidate running for office through financial contributions and/or by getting members and the general public to vote for that candidate. So if, during an election cycle, an interest group like Planned Parenthood runs an advertisement saying, "Vote Barack Obama," well, there could be some electioneering laws that have been violated. We'll talk about that later. But they're engaging in electioneering. They're trying to affect the outcome of an election. Interest groups tend to prefer lobbying to electioneering because it's a safer bet. If you spend a lot of money electioneering and your candidate loses, then you just made an enemy of the person taking power. But when lobbying has failed, when it is abundantly clear that an interest group is not going to get its way until there is a change in leadership, that's when they're going to rely on electioneering. And that can be an effective strategy for shaping public policy. Because if you change the outcome of elections, then you've changed who controls public policy in our country. And if you change who controls public policy, then yeah, the public policy is also going to be different. The third and final of the three major strategies favored by interest groups is what we call litigation. To litigate, remember from prior lecture, is just to take a legal action before the courts. And when we say that interest groups litigate to promote special interests, what we mean is that they are taking legal action before the courts in order to enforce a particular right or to promote a particular interest. So, for instance, you have organizations that operate to protect consumers from predatory business practices that might file class action lawsuits against particularly corrupt institutions and corporations like Comcast or AT&T. And when they file these class action lawsuits representing the hundreds of thousands of consumers who have been cheated or deceived or subject to predatory business practices by evil corporations, well, that is a form of litigation. And yes, I hate Comcast and AT&T. I'm betraying some bias here. One thing I will note is that these three strategies are not necessarily mutually exclusive. For instance, another form of litigation is filing an amicus brief. Remember from our discussion of the judicial branch that an amicus brief is just an advisory opinion submitted to a court by an interested third party, telling them how they should rule and why they should do so. So that's lobbying. It's attempting to influence a government decision maker because judges and justices are government decision makers. But it's also litigation because you're taking that action before a court. So filing amicus briefs is both litigating and lobbying. These, again, are the three major strategies that interest groups use, and it is worth noting that interest groups tend to be very successful. Again, one of the major reasons why people are concerned about interest groups is that they have, in our country, been so successful that sometimes public policy makers and government decision makers are more concerned with special interests than they are with the public interest. But the very fact that these interest groups have been so successful in getting public policy makers to side with them, sometimes over the general public, is somewhat surprising. And the reason that it's surprising is that all of the benefits or the goods that interest groups provide to the different demographics they represent are what we call public goods. Because remember, an interest group is an organization making public policy-related appeals to government decision makers. And those public policies are going to apply to everyone, regardless of who spent money campaigning for that law or that policy to be passed. A public good, I want you to understand, is a type of good or service that benefits everyone, regardless of who paid for it. You can contrast this with a private good that only benefits those who paid their fair share of the costs in order to achieve that good. So, for instance, if you think back to the first week of the semester, you might remember that I administered an assessment where I asked you to imagine that you were the mayor of a small community that had built a lighthouse from which every village on the entire island, yours and otherwise, benefited. But now that you and your village had paid the initial costs to build the lighthouse, you needed a consistent source of revenue to maintain the lighthouse. And because everybody on the island benefits from the lighthouse, not just the ones who paid to build it, you would like the neighboring villages to help pay their fair share. Well, what we're going to find is that even if they don't pay their fair share, they're going to benefit from the lighthouse because it's a public good. Contrast that with, say, a gym membership. If you and a group of your friends all came together and spent a whole bunch of money to build a home gym, and you didn't want people who were unwilling to contribute to the fund necessary to build and maintain that gym to access the exercise equipment, you would just lock the door. You have control of who accesses the gym and who gets to use that equipment and who does not, because that's a private good. Well, the public policies promoted by interest groups are all public goods, which means whether you spent money to lobby for a pro-Second Amendment initiative spearheaded by the NRA or not, you're going to be affected by that policy. If you're a gun collector and the NRA calls you and says, hey, give us some money so that we can look out for your interests, and you say no, they're not going to give up. They're not going to declare bankruptcy and shut their doors. They're going to go and they're going to find somebody else to give them the money, which means that you have an incentive to try and get a free ride. Why should you buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? Let somebody else pay for the lobbyists and simply benefit from the policies. This is what we call the free rider problem. The free rider problem is a prominent type of collective action problem that occurs anytime you're trying to provide a public good. A collective action problem, if you do not recall, might be defined as any dilemma that occurs when rational individuals stand to benefit from working together but nevertheless fail to do so. The free rider issue, in turn, can be defined as a particular type or example of a collective action problem, which occurs when some people who stand to benefit from a project do not contribute their fair share of the costs because they believe that others will complete the project anyway. This becomes an issue when those other individuals, seeing that some people are not paying their fair share, refuse to do the work or cover the costs, and as a result, nothing gets done and the public benefit is lost. Roads are a classic example. All of us love to drive on roads, but none of us want to pay our taxes. The lighthouse, again, is another example. On that assessment, some of you said, well, if the other villages aren't willing to pay their fair share of the costs necessary to maintain the lighthouse from which they are benefiting, I'm just going to turn the lighthouse off. Well, in that case, nobody gets the lighthouse. You have also lost the benefits. You've made a statement, but this is the free rider issue. Perhaps another example that some of you might relate to comes in the form of a group assignment. Everyone gets the same grade, but one kid does all the work. This becomes a problem when you get the same group over and over again, because eventually that one kid who's doing all the work gets tired of everyone else getting a free ride. And then he or she will say, okay, you know what? If you're not going to do your fair share of the work, I'm not going to do mine. Forget it. We're all going to fail together. That's the free rider issue. And that's a problem that any organization dealing in public policy has to overcome, because public policy is public. It's a public good. Roads are a public good. Now, governments are able to overcome these kinds of free rider problems, these collective action problems, using coercion. If you don't pay your fair share of the taxes necessary to maintain the roads or to keep the lighthouse operational, the government's going to send men with guns to your house and you're going to jail. But interest groups don't have that same power. If you have a left-wing economic interest group that seeks to increase taxes, they can't force you to help pay for their lobbying efforts to convince people in power to pass those kind of laws. So how do they get you to actually volunteer your time, money, or resources to a cause with which you might agree, but from which you could benefit whether you pay the costs or you get a free ride? Well, they're able to overcome the free rider issue without using coercion by offering what we call selective incentives or selective benefits. Selective incentives or selective benefits are a type of private good used by interest groups to incentivize individuals to participate in their efforts to promote special interests rather than trying to get a free ride. They are called selective benefits because these are the benefits that are given only to contributing members of an interest group or cause. They are called selective incentives because they incentivize participation over free riding. The three major types of selective incentive or benefit that you need to be familiar with for the purposes of tests and this class are listed on the bottom right side of this screen. They are material incentives, solidary incentives, and purposive incentives, which are sometimes called material benefits, solidary benefits, and purposive benefits. We're going to go through each of these one by one. Material benefits are economic goods or services that individuals receive in exchange for participation in an interest group. So, for example, one of the largest and most powerful interest groups in terms of membership in the United States is an organization called the AARP, or American Association of Retired Persons. You probably know a senior citizen who is a member of the AARP. You might also know that the AARP is an interest group that spends a great deal of time, money, and energy lobbying on behalf of the special interests of senior citizens and retired persons in our country. They also have a huge membership, including individuals as unrelated and as disparate as Michelle Obama and Laura Bush, the former First Ladies married to former President Bush and Barack Obama, respectively. And how are they able to get all these different people with very different ideas about what the government should be doing to cooperate and work together? To be a member of the AARP, by the way, you have to pay a monthly fee. So how are they able to convince their members to pay the monthly fees for membership necessary for the organization to fund its lobbying efforts? Well, by offering material incentives or benefits to those who do pay those fees. For instance, one of the material benefits you get in exchange for paying monthly membership dues and being a part of the AARP is a weekly magazine, which contains, in addition to some other things, coupons for prescription medicine, for discount travel, for the installation of ramps or those stairmasters that drive you up the wall. These are all tangible economic goods or services that that interest group will offer to you, but only if you are a dues-paying member. So if you want those benefits, you can't get a free ride. You have to pay because they are a private good, a material incentive or benefit which incentivizes you to participate in the organization, thereby circumventing and overcoming the free rider issue. The next major type of selective incentive or benefit is the solidary benefit. Solidary benefits are the social, professional, and psychological gains that we derive from surrounding ourselves by like-minded individuals. For instance, networking is a type of solidary benefit. If you have an interest in a career in the legal field, whether you want to be an attorney, a judge, or a clerk, I would suggest joining an interest group that represents the wants, needs, and expectations of legal professionals. Why? Well, because every other member of that interest group is going to be somebody who is either currently or aspiring to become a part of the legal community. So you'll get to meet a lot of people who might be able to do things like let you know when there are new job positions at their firm, or write you recommendations, so on and so forth. Another type of solidary incentive is the social benefit you derive from surrounding yourself with people who have similar interests. The Poker's Player Alliance, for instance, is a lobbying interest group with a lot of members who love to play poker. And many of these poker-playing members don't actually realize that they've joined an interest group. They pay dues and join the Poker's Player Alliance not because they're expecting their money to go towards lobbying the government, but because they want people to play poker with. And in exchange for being a member of that organization, for paying their fair share of the costs entailed by lobbying for the interests of poker players, they gain access to private poker games, and they gain access to a whole bunch of other people who are also looking for friends to play cards with. Finally, we've got purposive benefits. Purposive benefits are basically the psychological, moral, and ideological satisfaction that we derive from contributing to a cause that we believe in. So, for example, the Children's Defense Fund is an interest group that lobbies primarily on behalf of children. It campaigns against things like child abuse and for the expansion of funds for early childhood education, so on and so forth. And what we're going to find is that the primary beneficiaries of the public goods, of the public policies that the CDA, or Children's Defense Fund, campaigns for, are children who don't have money, who aren't the ones funding this, who aren't the ones volunteering their time. Adults who are not the primary beneficiaries of what this organization does are the ones who cover the costs. Why? Well, because they feel very strongly that it's important to protect vulnerable people in our society, and they recognize children are vulnerable. They want to be a part of the solution and not the problem. These are the sorts of people who walk around with their eyes closed sniffing their own farts all day. These are the sorts of people who recognize that it feels good to do good. That when you contribute to a cause you believe in, you get a sense of social or moral superiority or satisfaction. This is not bad. I'm trying to be a little humorous with my disparaging remarks, but at the end of the day, if you're dealing with a really controversial issue like abortion or something that people really care about like child abuse, sometimes you don't need to use either coercion or selective incentives of the material/solidary variety to get them to participate. People will participate simply because they care that much about the issue. And they want to do something good without expecting anything in return. Those are purposive social and psychological benefits that they gain from participating. And this is a private type of good because you're not going to get the satisfaction of a job well done unless you do the job. All right, so now we've talked about interest groups, and we can move on to the next segment of lecture where we begin to talk about political parties. We're going to talk about what political parties are, what they do, and what their three components or faces happen to be. That's PIG, party in government; PI, party in the electorate; and PO, or party organization. We're going to talk about what party systems are. We'll talk about what party system is currently present in the United States and why, discussing ultimately a concept called Duverger's law. Let's go ahead and start by reminding ourselves of the definition of political parties. A political party is very simply an association of political activists who organize to win elections, operate government, and gain direct control over public policy. And in the United States, what we're going to discover is that political parties have 5 major activities that they engage in order to fulfill this electoral agenda of winning elections, controlling government, and public policy. They find and recruit candidates. They help those candidates to run their own campaigns, although this is less true than it used to be. They present the public with policy alternatives that we can choose between. If you are not happy with the platform of the Republican Party, you can vote Democrat. If you're not happy with the platform of the Democrat Party, you can vote Republican, and vice versa. Finally, they are either going to operate government, which is what the Democrats are currently doing because they won the last election and are therefore in power, or they can oppose the party in power, which is what the Republicans are doing because they lost the last election, but did maintain enough seats in government to obstruct the agenda of the Democrat Party, or from their perspective, engage in damage control. And what we're going to find is that we, the American people, sometimes benefit from the presence of political parties. Because even though a lot of us are very dissatisfied with both of the major parties, Republicans and Democrats, political parties make it easier for us to cast informed ballots. We don't have time necessarily to research the positions of every candidate in every election on every issue that we might care about, but fortunately we don't have to. If a candidate runs as a Republican, you know that they're probably going to adopt the conservative position on most issues. If they run as Democrat, you know that they're probably going to adopt liberal positions on most issues. This isn't a perfect system, but it's definitely better than simply casting blind ballots, which is what a lot of us would have to do without political parties, because we're just very low information voters. And they help us to control government by bridging the separation of powers. In other words, they act as what some scholars have called legislative cartels. They decide what laws are going to make it through the process and what laws are not going to make it through the process. And they're only able to do this because they're not just winning 1 or 2 seats in Congress here or there, they're organizing nationwide to win a whole bunch of seats not only in the House and in the Senate, but also over in the executive elections and at the state level. So we use political parties to push our favored policy platforms into law and to help us cast informed votes when we ourselves haven't had the time, energy, or motivation to do a lot of research. But sometimes we make the mistake of thinking that political parties are unitary actors. If you don't know, a unitary actor is basically an actor with a single will, a single goal that makes unified efforts to achieve that goal without any internal dissension. But in reality, what we're going to find is that political parties have a great deal of internal disagreement and strife. And a part of why you see so much competition within the political parties is because political parties today in our country, generally speaking, are made up of 3 different groups of people or faces, which each have their own set of priorities, strategies, and ideas about the proper function and direction of the party as a whole. First, we have the party organization. Parties are private clubs. They have a bureaucratic structure, very similar to government or to private corporations. And PO, or the party organization, is the face or portion of the political party that is going to facilitate its infrastructure. It's going to gather and organize its events and activities. So there is officially a Republican Party organization and a Democrat Party organization. And they are going to be led by groups of individuals called the RNC, Republican National Committee, and DNC, or Democrat National Committee. And their jobs are going to be to do things like organize primary elections, or help to adopt the platforms, or count ballots in private elections, and fundraise to help candidates push their campaign messages to the public during election season, so on and so forth. But then we also have the party in government, or PIG. And the party in government is going to be made up of every member of a political party who also holds a position as a government decision maker. So if you hold an official position in government and are a Republican, we would say that you're a part of the Republican PIG. Congressman Mark Wayne Mullen is a Republican. He's also in Congress. Therefore, he is a part of the Republican PIG. President Joe Biden is a Democrat. He's also a part of the government. So he's a part of the Democrat PIG. Contrast this with the party organization, or PO, that we talked about just a moment ago. Jamie Harrison is currently the chair of the DNC, Democrat National Committee. His job as chair of that committee is to organize the strategic fundraising and political efforts of the Democratic political party. He is a part of the governing body of the Democratic Party. He's a part of the PO. And you have similar individuals on the Republican side. So if you hold an official position with a political party, whether it's paid or volunteer, doesn't matter, but if you hold an official position, if you are an employee or a volunteer with the Republicans or the Democrats, but you don't hold a position in government, then you are a part of your party's PO. Most of us do not fall into either of these categories. Generally speaking, individuals who are members of party fall into the third group and the largest, arguably the most important part of the political party, the party in the electorate, or PI. The party in the electorate is that portion of the party which holds no official position with the party or in government. In other words, the party in the electorate, or PI, is the rank and file membership. To be a member of a political party's PI, or party in the electorate, you simply need to register with, consistently vote for, or associate with that party. Now, I do want to be clear. Not all states require voters to register with a party. And so it is sufficient to simply say, I'm a Republican or I am a Democrat in order to count as a part of that party's PI. Even if you claim to be an independent, you say, I'm neither a Republican or a Democrat. If you consistently vote for Republican candidates, you are a part of the Republican PI. If you consistently vote for Democrats, you are part of the Democrat PI. And what we're going to discover is that while the party in government is charged with taking the party's platform and translating it into policy, fulfilling campaign promises, running government, and creating policies that are consistent with the wants, needs, and expectations of the PO and PI, the party organization's job is to organize and provide infrastructure so that the party continues to function, and the party in the electorate's job is to evaluate the party in government, to participate in the events organized by the PO, and to vote for individuals who will help take the party's platform and translate it into public policy. What we will discover is that the pig pie and PO often have very different ideas about what that means and what people should be doing or who they should be supporting. Remember, for instance, that party organizations are the sort of bread and butter. They are the machinery of the political party, and their job is to keep it functioning. So they're concerned with things like their ability to raise revenue and continue to win elections so that people will continue to give them money and keep them employed and keep them operating so that they can continue to control government. Well, what that means is that they're going to tend to prioritize less ideological but more electable candidates. The party in the electorate is a little bit different. The party in the electorate is going to tend to favor candidates that agree more with their ideology, the ideology that motivated them to join or associate with the party in the first place. So you'll have instances where, let's say it's 2016, and a substantial portion of the party in the electorate for the Democrats is supporting the elderly socialist Bernie Sanders, who is very, very appealing to the far-left rank-and-file members of the Democratic Party in the electorate, but who is probably not very appealing to the general electorate, and therefore the party organization in 2016 was very afraid of him. He had a lot of popularity among rank-and-file Democrats who are primarily ideological, but the party organization is much more pragmatic. It's practical. And it says, hey, look, we don't just want a candidate who's going to pursue our agenda. We want a candidate who isn't going to alienate our donors and who has a real chance of winning. So maybe instead of him, let's go with someone a little more mainstream. Let's try Hillary Clinton, who's super rich and can help us fundraise. And so during that election, it turned out that the Democrat PO was trying very hard to help Hillary Clinton win the primary and get the party's nomination. But remember that it is theoretically the party in the electorate that is supposed to evaluate and choose which leaders are being run by the party when they cast ballots during their party's primary election. The PO is just supposed to count those ballots. It's not supposed to control the outcome of the election. It's supposed to facilitate it and provide infrastructure. But they had different ideas about what direction to take the party in, and therefore they were fighting. And we saw similar things happening on the Republican side. The Republican Party organization and party and government were both very, very concerned that the eventual 2016 nominee, Donald Trump, would hurt the party's ability to push its policies, hurt its congressional party and government members in their ability to get reelected, and hurt the fundraising efforts necessary to maintain the organization. But it turned out that Donald Trump had a lot of popularity within the party and the electorate. So there are internal struggles that take place within a political party. Now, the next and the final subject for this video is the concept of a party system. And if you look at the questions on the slide, I've chosen some that help to illustrate that the United States has what we call a two-party system. So I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, what are the two major parties in the United States? You probably know that that's the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. You probably know that the color associated with the Republican Party is red. The color associated with the Democrat Party is blue. Republicans use the elephant as their mascot, whereas Democrats use the donkey. The Democratic Party tends to be liberal, and the Republican Party tends to be conservative. But this visibility is actually somewhat surprising, right? Because contrary to what you might think, Republicans and Democrats do not make up a majority of the general population. Indeed, what we're going to find is that a plurality of American voters, something about 40% of American voters, identify independent. They say, I am neither a Republican nor am I a Democrat. But Republicans and Democrats consistently win in elections. If you look at our current president, for example, he's a Democrat who replaced a Republican, who replaced a Democrat, who replaced a Republican. And you can do this for a very long time. But what you're not going to be able to do is to identify an independent or third-party president in recent history. And the same thing is true on the congressional side. If you look at the current United States Senate and the current United States House, you're going to find that about half of the United States Senate and half of the United States House is Republican, while the other half is Democrat. Numbers vary just a little bit, but it's always going to lend itself to dominance by these two political parties. Even though 40% of us identify either with third parties or as independents, you don't have any third-party candidates in the entire federal government, and you only have 2 independents in the entire United States legislature at the time that this video is being filmed. By the way, those are Bernie Sanders and Angus King, both of whom caucus 100% of the time with the Democrat political party on party line votes, and both of whom formally ran for president as Democrats. So while on paper they played themselves off as independents, the fact of the matter is that really, for all effects and purposes, they're Democrats. And that means that there are effectively no representatives in either the House or the Senate in the entire federal government who are providing descriptive representation for independent or third-party voters, even though independent and third-party voters outnumber both Republicans and Democrats. So how do we explain this? Why is it that we have so many independents and third-party voters in the general public, but only Republican and Democrat candidates seem to win any elections? Well, in order to understand that, we need to talk about some important concepts. First, let's define the concept of a party system. A party system is a relatively durable system of institutional, legal, and social or psychological forces that limit the number of parties that can exist in equilibrium within a single country and determine how political parties interact with one another, control government, and compete in elections. It is important to understand that party systems are defined by institutional, legal, and social and psychological forces that limit the activities and number of parties, and it is also important to understand that these party systems define how parties interact and compete in elections and control government. In the United States, we have a two-party system. And what that means is that we have a party system in which 2 parties routinely dominate government. Our government is consistently controlled either by Republicans or Democrats, or in some cases, when we have what's called mixed party government, a combination of the 2. But it has never been controlled by the Libertarian Party or the Green Party. Why? because the two-party system limits the number of political parties that can exist in equilibrium in our country to two. When you start getting third parties, one of the two major parties either absorb the third party or render it completely moot and irrelevant by completely keeping it out of government. And there are a variety of ways that they go about doing this. But I want you to understand, and I want you to note, that the number one most important cause of the two-party system in our country is our use of majoritarian and plurality democracy as a system of representation. Majoritarian or plurality democracy is a system of representative democracy in which individual candidates compete for government decisions in winner-takes-all elections. In a plurality election, the candidate who gets the most votes wins, even if he or she has less than 50% of the overall vote. For instance, if you look at the pie diagram on this slide, you're going to see the results of the 2016 Republican presidential primary. During the Republican presidential primary of 2016, Donald Trump only received about 45% of the vote. Ted Cruz received 25%, John Kasich 14%, and Marco Rubio got about 11%. The remaining 5% or so went to other candidates. What this means is that about 65%, a substantial majority of Republicans, voted against Donald Trump in 2016. But because Donald Trump got a larger share of the vote than any other candidate, he won the election and got to serve as the Republican candidate for president, eventually winning in the general election to become president of the United States. Some states, however, have requirements that the winner in an election must receive a majority of the votes, i.e. more than 50%. Such elections are called majoritarian. When a state has a majoritarian electoral system, in the event that no candidate receives the minimum number of votes, 50% plus 1, the top two candidates have a runoff election, and this is a second election during which voters are given the ability to select from one of the two options identified as the first and second place candidates in the original election. I want you to understand that both majoritarian and plurality wins elections are winner-takes-all system. There is no prize for second place in either system. And because there is no prize for second place, such elections incentivize what we call strategic voting. Strategic voting is an approach to casting ballots in which voters support the candidate most likely to defeat their least favorite option, rather than simply voting for whichever candidate they like the best. For instance, if it were 2016 and I were a supporter of the Libertarian Party candidate for president, Gary Johnson, or if I supported another third-party candidate, say Jill Stein, I probably wouldn't vote for that candidate. Maybe I really like Gary Johnson or Jill Stein, but because I know that they're less likely to win, I might support Hillary Clinton just to prevent Donald Trump from winning, or I might support Trump to prevent Clinton from winning. Perhaps I like Gary Johnson better than Trump, but I really, really hate Hillary Clinton. And so I will vote for Donald Trump because really I'm voting against Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump is the most likely to succeed. Conversely, perhaps my ideal option is Jill Stein, but I realize that Jill Stein, as a third-party candidate, has no real chance of winning. And I'm afraid that if I vote for Jill Stein, I will have wasted my vote, and because I cast my ballot for Jill Stein instead of Hillary Clinton, that might throw the election to Donald Trump. So I will vote against Donald Trump by supporting the candidate most likely to defeat him, Hillary Clinton, even though my ideal ideological option would be Jill Stein. So because winner-takes-all systems lead to strategic voting, they almost always have a two-party system in which two parties routinely dominate government. This tendency of plurality or majoritarian elections to create two-party systems is called Duverger's law. Duverger's law is an empirical pattern or tendency within which countries with simple plurality or majority rule elections will tend towards having exactly two parties. To understand why Duverger's law seems to hold true in almost all cases where you see plurality or winner-takes-all systems, imagine America's political parties arranged on a spectrum from extreme liberal to far right. The far right and far left ends of this spectrum are called extreme, not because they're necessarily wrong, but because they've gone too far in one direction or the other for most voters. Consequently, most voters will tend to rest somewhere in the center-right or center-left. Because parties want to win elections, they'll tend to gravitate towards the center, where most voters are comfortable. In these conditions, creating a party on the far right will likely take votes from the center-right candidate and therefore throw the election towards the center-left. Since the center-left is less appealing to a far-right voter than the center-right, far-right extremists will engage in strategic voting and support the center-right party. Conversely, most far-left candidates will support a moderate liberal over a far-left-wing candidate who is more ideologically similar to them, simply because the moderate left-wing candidate has a better chance of defeating any conservative or right-wing opponents. So what we're going to find, then, is that one possible solution to this problem, if you think of it as a problem, is to adopt a proportional electoral system as an alternative. In a proportional system, voters cast ballots for parties instead of voting for particular candidates. Those parties then gain a number of seats in government proportional to the percentage of the votes they receive. Consequently, proportional electoral systems reward candidates for receiving votes even if they don't come in first place. There is all of a sudden a reward for second place. So for instance, let's imagine that we use this system for the United States Senate because there are exactly 100 seats in the United States Senate, and that makes for easy math. Instead of each voter getting together to decide who from a list of candidates will be their representative, we are going to have a national vote where every voter is given an opportunity to vote for their favorite political party. Let's limit our focus to the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, and the Libertarian Party for the sake of easy illustration. Let's say that about 40% of the public votes Democrat and 40% votes Republican. Then 20% votes Libertarian. Now the Libertarians didn't quote-unquote win this election by any stretch of the imagination, because both the Republicans and the Democrats got more votes than the Libertarians. But because the Libertarians got 20% of the vote, they're going to get 20 out of 100 seats in the United States Senate. Republicans would get 40, and the Democrats would also get 40. Now, 20 out of 100 is not ideal if you're a Libertarian. You'd probably prefer something more like 50, 60, or 100 out of 100. But 20 out of 100 is a lot better for you than what you currently have in our plurality system, which is 0. There are no Libertarians. Gary Johnson didn't really have a good chance of competing and winning in our election system. Because even if you liked Gary Johnson, you probably weren't going to vote for him for fear of, quote-unquote, wasting your vote. You would engage in strategic voting. But what we're going to discover is that in proportional systems, you don't have to worry about wasting your vote. Because if your party loses the election, your vote might still help to minimize how severe that loss happens to be. Even if you don't come in first place, voting for your favorite party does have some dividends to pay off. If you're having trouble with these ideas, or you think that you would benefit from some visual aids, I would refer you to the videos linked in the optional resources for this lecture, because they will elaborate on all of these points. The bottom line here is that Duverger's law tells us that the #1 cause of America's persistent two-party dominion, or two-party system, is our use of winner-takes-all plurality elections. There are some other causes that are worth talking about. The Republicans and the Democrats have both been around for a very long time. They've got a lot of history. Both of these are 18th century parties. The Democrat Party was founded by Andrew Jackson. The Republican Party was founded leading up to the Civil War, basically by Abraham Lincoln. And so they've got well over a couple centuries at this point of history, and so they're really familiar to us. The fact that they're really familiar to us and the fact that they continuously dominate government also means that they get a lot of free publicity, so they're really visible. We vote for the devils we know over the angels we don't. We won't support libertarians even if we are libertarians, because we don't really know anything about libertarians or the Libertarian Party. And then finally, and this is kind of a cyclical process, because of the history, visibility, and the legal advantages, and our Duverger's law scenario, Republicans and Democrats are in control of government. Government makes the laws governing elections. And so Republicans and Democrats have built-in advantages that help to ensure and continue two-party dominance. There is one final possibility worth discussing. Some people have argued that the reason we have a two-party system in the United States is that the United States is polarized in a culture war. A culture war is basically when you have half of the population on the far right and half on the far left with very little overlap and no moderates. However, I want you to understand that the idea that the United States is very polarized in the general public, that we're divided in a culture war, is controversial among academics. It actually might be that while our leaders are very polarized, the American public is just as moderate as we've ever been. There is some data to suggest that this is probably true. The Republicans and Democrats are polarizing because they're answering to special interests due to the primary election system, so on and so forth, but the general public isn't. And this seems to be true when you look at really controversial issues like abortion. Because if you talk to the average Democrat candidate for president, they say, yay, all the abortions. If you talk to your typical Republican candidate for president, they say, no, none of the abortions. But most Americans are circumstantial. They say that abortion should generally be subject to restriction, but that it should be allowable in special circumstances like rape, threat to maternal life, or fetal abnormality. That's not the idea of the American people you would get from listening to our leaders, but that doesn't mean we're polarized. It just means that the options we're being asked to choose between are polarized. It's also important to understand that this polarization, if it is occurring in the public, seems to be relatively recent, whereas the two-party system is quite old. So again, whether or not we have a culture war is subject to ongoing debate in the academic community. There is some evidence that it might just be a media fabrication or that it's only taking place among political leaders. But whether it's real or not, it's not a good explanation for the two-party system because the two-party system outdates it. So again, number one most important reason for two-party dominion in our country, plurality elections. Some other contributing factors, history, visibility, and biased electoral rules. I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. Thank you for listening.